Do you remember Rule of Rose? It's a survival horror game commonly referred to as the banned horror game. But that's not completely true. I mean, it's very controversial, but not much banning ever went on, but rather so much controversy, like tons of it, the likes of which would go on to actually doom this game. Rule of Rose is an older survival horror game developed by Punchline for the PlayStation 2 that would go on to release January of 2006 in Japan. The game focuses heavily on psychological horror told through the eyes of a young adult and in the gameplay genre of survival horror, most similar to like Silent Hill. The game and its story takes place in the United Kingdom. Though, ironically, due to the before mentioned controversy, this game would never even release in this country. And so we find ourselves back to the controversy, something I've mentioned exactly 4 times up to now. But how did it all begin? Well, with a simple negative magazine article. Though, this article wasn't even the writer's own work. It was completely plagiarized and obvious the writer hadn't even played this game. But before we dive any deeper into the controversy, before I can even begin to explain it, it's important that you understand what goes on in Rule of Rose and understand the subjects it tackles. So please, give me a couple of minutes as I lay everything out, as you just won't really understand why it's controversial, if not. I really hope that makes sense. It should. Let's get into it. Rule of Rose is a journey into Jennifer's fractured mind as she relives her most traumatic memories in an attempt to put them back together. The story isn't explicitly told though, as just like Jennifer's memory, it's all over the place, leaving you to look for the bits and pieces and put it back together yourself. Basically, an adult Jennifer is looking back on old memories through her current self. And so, by the end of the game, you can put together a solid series of events and understand what Jennifer has been through. And so, from this, we can learn it all begins on an airship. Jennifer and her parents were on this airship to an unknown destination, but of course something went wrong. Something always goes wrong. And the airship went down with Jennifer being the only survivor. She was then found and taken by a man who had lost his own child. And in a sick way to cope with that, he took Jennifer and forced her to pretend to be that child he lost. Eventually, Jennifer met Wendy, another girl who she became super close with. Wendy lived in an orphanage nearby, and as time passed, the two of them created and acted upon a plan to have Jennifer escape the man and live in the orphanage. At this point, it seems like it can't get any worse for Jennifer and that things are finally looking up. But eventually, even the orphanage became a dark place for poor Jennifer. It all started when Jennifer found a dog, Brown, and Wendy became extremely jealous of her new friend. She then goes on to create a club dedicated to making members of the orphanage miserable, more specifically Jennifer. It was basically created to make Jennifer's life harder. This went on to include all sorts of abuse, bullying, and much more that we get glimpses of during the game. This continues on and reaches its climax when Wendy somehow finds a way to turn the man from before on the orphanage, causing some sort of massacre that Jennifer just barely survives before rolling the credits, the game ending. With this, you can tell Rule of Rose is pretty messed up and definitely fits the bill for psychological survival horror. Still, it's not really doing anything survival horror hasn't done before scare-wise. The most alarming bit is the obvious involvement of children, but even then, it's done in a way to be frightening. It's not for shock value or anything extreme, but rather to push the game's themes, something Rule of Rose takes very seriously. Some of its biggest themes showcase ideas like how heavily trauma can affect people, how easily children can be affected by things like trauma, and most of all, tons of ideas about human differences in general. It's very important to understand that at no point during the game do they encourage the acts going on nor showcase any type of violence against children. In the game, as well as interviews, they make it very clear that they use children to explore and enforce the game's themes, not encourage violence against them. The most we actually see is a scene where Jennifer is pushed into a coffin and some hurt animals here and there, never going any further than that. So please remember that. With that, we have all of the puzzle pieces we need, I think, well, at least we have most of them, to finally take a look at why this game and its story was just so controversial on its release. After Rule of Rose's initial release, it was gearing up to release to the rest of the world. But of course, due to Rule of Rose's graphic and weird nature, these publishers were wary on how they would sell and release this game. At first, Sony was meant to publish the game in America, but later they refused, allegedly because they believed it just didn't fit their brand image. From there, Rule of Rose fell into Atlus's hands, and after playing and checking the game themselves, they realized there really was nothing to be afraid of, something it'll become very clear that nobody else really did. And so, Rule of Rose eventually made its way into America with little to no problems. While Rule of Rose's release in America was somewhat bumpy, it went pretty smooth, and it eventually made it. But the same can't be said for the rest of the world. The big issues begin in Europe, with an article all about Rule of Rose published by Panorama, an Italian magazine company. This wasn't a positive article though. It was a negative review published by a journalist named Guido Castigliano. I think that is probably incorrect. I am so sorry. But they published their article with an opening saying, "A little girl is buried alive after psychosexual and physical violence of all kinds. Her tormentors? Other girls. It's bad. Very bad. It's the plot of a horror title that's about to arrive." Obviously, this opening would shock anyone. Anyone at all. And it gets worse and worse as the article goes on to describe more and more about the game. They mention the coffin scene in great detail, describing a scene where Jennifer is buried alive, which never happens in the game by the way. She's brought up to an airship in a coffin. Everything mentions this scene for some reason, but none of them cared to fact check it. Anyways, the article then goes on to mention the violence from the game and the apparent sexual nature of it. But I think the worst part of this whole article is that it's pretty much completely plagiarized. You see, a while before this article released, and when the game originally came out in Japan, reviews were popping up everywhere, as they do. But one review by Chris Darrell was special. He wrote a completely normal review on the game. But that simple, normal review must have been really good, as the article had clearly taken tons from the review. Taken is probably too kind, as it really seemed like Chris's review had been copied, but with a super negative spin, most definitely trying to create some problems. And my phone just went off. That's great. That was an amazing take too. They took tons of Chris's review and made the article we're talking about today, with big parts of that article not even being true, and if they are, they're super over-exaggerated. The biggest of these claims is the accusation of perversion. With the game featuring a plot around children, this is a huge problem if it's true, but it's flat out not true. There is not one part of this game that is sexualized, with the scenes referenced to being nowhere near to what they're saying. It's stated from the scene where she's quote-unquote buried alive is shot from her feet, with her immature form visible. First of all, she is wearing shoes. Second of all, buried alive, you literally see the light. It bothers me. Third of all, the model for Jennifer for this whole entire game is her as an adult. It's kind of the point of the whole game. Her now looking back at her memories from then. This isn't the only scene they bring up either, but with all the scenes mentioned, you can pretty much say the same exact things. It's an overreaction and just not true. But that's not even it. The writer of this article went as far as adding quotes from the game's creator. But these quotes are either completely made up, or they're maybe terrible explanations of existing quotes. I can't really tell. Regardless, he just never said these things. Overall, everything in this article screams that it's a them problem, with parts of the article debating the effects of video games in general and them using Rule of Rose as a way to prove their point. Their point being, of course, video games inspire all of the bad in the world. This debate really isn't the issue here though. The issues arise when it's pretty clear the writer not only didn't play the game, but copied an already existing review to turn it into a damaging, untrue, slanderous article. A very messy article at that. Still, plagiarized or not, even if its contents are clearly untrue, and the work is very messily written, this article would go on to be the worst thing to happen to Rule of Rose. By this point, the game was already rated as 16 and up by Peggy, with them even explaining that they have no idea why there's so much misinformation around this game. And even though this statement should have been enough to disprove this article, it ultimately wouldn't matter one bit, as this article would seem to be the catalyst for everything. Not only did it paint the game in a terrible light, it caught the attention of government officials. This began in Europe, with members of parliament asking for this game to be outright banned, citing the killing of a girl in game? Yeah, instead of presenting the game honestly, considering these guys are meant to be the people passing the bills for the country, I kind of expect them to be honest by, presenting the psychological aspects, mentioning maybe the few scenes with animals. To be fair, they just jump straight to the girl dies. She's buried alive, dead. Just ban the whole game. And yet again, this didn't even happen like this. The European Justice Minister also attacked the game, saying that it's too brutal and that Peggy needs to change its rating system. Even though, as we've already seen, they thoroughly investigated the game for themselves, realized it's an overreaction, and gave it a rating they thought was very fitting. These controversies, as well as several other smaller incidents all across the world, resulted in 505 games backing out of several countries. It just wouldn't be worth it to try and release the game if all they were going to try and do was ban it. This ended up with Rule of Rose being cancelled entirely in the United Kingdom, New Zealand, as well as Australia. Cancelled. Not banned, by the way. It was never banned. People in these countries were even able to get some review copies. It just was never publicly sold in these places. As for Europe, the place this controversy all erupted in, they finally saw Rule of Rose on its shelves November 2006. But even then, the damage was already done. While sales aren't publicly available, I think it's fair to assume the game probably didn't sell very well at all, with estimates placing copies sold between 10 and 20,000. Very low. This would even be Punchline's last game together as a team, with members all going their separate ways after Rule of Rose. And overall, I guess I kinda get why. Though completely overblown and unfair false controversy, it's a valid assumption to say sellers just may have not wanted to bother with the game this controversial. Even worse, say someone was interested and was able to find a seller, the game's reviews weren't exactly the most positive either, most likely steering away people who were willing to ignore the controversy. It was just too late. The damage was already done. Rule of Rose was pretty much dead on arrival, left to fade into obscurity and eventually be forgotten about completely. While there is a small and very dedicated fanbase to the game, it doesn't really stand to grow, as emulation can be a pain in the ass and trying to find a copy of the game can go for a few hundred to thousands. I thought the game was cool. No, actually that doesn't even matter. Asking over a couple hundred for a rare game is just insane. It shouldn't be allowed. It should be illegal. But with that, a new question comes to life. Could Rule of Rose make a comeback? Well, can it come back and would it be successful are two different questions, and the answers I think are very different for each question. I cannot see Rule of Rose being able to come back at all. Considering Sony hasn't acknowledged the game since they refused to publish it, there's not much hope, if any at all. If that was to change and someone really tried to bring it back, I think it would still be nothing but risky. With the game's original reviews not being so great, and most of all the controversy it had, it just probably doesn't stand a chance. Things reviews complained about can be fixed, they can be improved upon, but something like controversy, well, with the big brand being behind the game, they're not going to take that risk. They're not going to risk it happening again. Even if the original controversy was stupid, it should have never happened. As for would it be successful, I think it would be. I think Rule of Rose now would be really well liked. Survival horror is more popular than ever, especially the games that have open-ended stories like Rule of Rose, with whole communities forming around these games and especially their questions. Still, I don't think it could be a re-release. While the original game is obviously playable, there are a ton of reasons on why it has not so great reviews. This isn't a review, so obviously I won't really dive into that, but my biggest complaint was that I have to say this game is like a door simulator. Rule of Rose is a door simulator. When I finished the game, I had felt like I had spent more time in door-related animations and loading screens pertaining to doors than actually playing the game. Seriously. The director of the game once said in an interview that they were only about 80% satisfied with the game and would have liked to work on it a lot more. And with that statement in mind, I really think a remaster, or better yet a remake, would do the game so much more justice. Reasons being, statement from before, as well as the heaps of unused content the game had. I think if the gameplay got the fixes it needs, the story was improved upon with all the unused content that seemed like it was really meant to be in the game in the first place, it really would be something great. Something that stands up there with Silent Hill, the new Resident Evil remakes, Dead Space, things like that. Ultimately, I think if Rule of Rose got a second chance in today's market with a remake or remaster, it would be very successful. Sadly, I just don't see it happening. Never. And that really sucks. Rule of Rose never really stood a chance, all because of a stupid article, plagiarized article, that ultimately doomed the game. It deserved more, better, a lot of things. And from there, I can only hope this game finds some crazy way to make it back into the spotlight and possibly return. It would be fitting. After all, a crazy controversy is the only reason I'm talking about Rule of Rose today. It making a crazy return would be perfect. But hey, if you see this video and it got you interested in the game, you could buy it, I guess. Please don't. But I really recommend emulating and trying it yourself if you're interested. I also want to thank the game's small but strong community. Everything in this game has been well archived, and even though it's old, all the talk I've seen about this game during research has been nothing but hopeful and positive. Thank you yet again. With that, it's the end of the video. I don't really have much to say except thank you for watching. Please leave a comment, let me know what you think, anything. I'll always say it, but I love reading the comments. I also do want to note that my mic is absolutely breaking. If you hear little random noises and it's weird, I'm trying to deal with it because things are expensive. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time.